this is Erica Wood from the Hopkins County Extension Office, and I'm back with another video. And today I'm going to talk about this lovely houseplant here. It is our African violet, and African violets are a very common houseplant, and they've been in production for, over 100 years, honestly. They've been kind of a fan favorite of many houseplant enthusiasts and have been grown for quite some time. There's a lot of different hybrids and cultivars that are out there. And the reason why people enjoy growing African violets is because they have a very floriferous nature. They flower constantly. And a lot of times they are going to be flowering for you most of the time out of the year, especially if you give them the right conditions. Now, of course, the violet that I have here today is not flowering, but I'll definitely kind of post on there on this video some of the different flowers of violets that I've had currently and in the past that have bloomed for me pretty well, so you can kind of see them. And so when it comes to African violets, they have this just beautiful kind of basal rosette of foliage. And honestly, depending on the cultivar that you get, the foliage shape can vary a little bit. Sometimes it might have kind of more of this wavy, frilly nature, especially along the margins of the leaves. Sometimes the leaves may be more of a lighter green, dark green, or even kind of this greenish purpley color. There are variegated varieties of African violets that may have a yellow or white variegation to them as well. And which is the case for pretty much all African violets, they have that very fuzzy leaf nature that a lot of times we can't help but want to touch. And then kind of, towards the center of the plant, you'll get these flower stalks that come out, and they're beautiful flower colors from anything from whites, pinks, purples, and all colors, like kind of in between that, or they're maybe bicolored in nature. There's a lot of options out there when it comes to different colors. And even the blooms themselves may, look a little bit different depending on the cultivar. They have different flower shapes, and they also may have some mottling or spotting on the flowers. And they may even look a little bit more frilly. They may have kind of a more simple, or they may have like a double, flower, a double bloom on them, just kind of depending on what's out there. So there's so many varieties out there. And honestly, the African Violet Society really showcases some of the different classifications there as well. And so whenever you're growing African violets, you're growing them because primarily you want the blooms, although I do think the foliage is really lovely even on its own. When it comes to trying to get it to flower for you, you want to make sure you have the right conditions for it. So when it comes to African violets, I have found that they just love east-facing windows. That's kind of the sweet spot for them in a house. North-facing is usually too shaded. They may survive there, but their foliage may get elongated. They may not bloom very much. South-facing is just more than likely could be too hot, especially if it's pretty intense light. West-facing may not be so bad. You just want to watch that afternoon sun and make sure that it doesn't get too hot where it could potentially scorch the leaves. So kind of that east facing is perfect because that sunlight, that morning light is generally pretty gentle, and then they get a little bit more of that afternoon shade. And that's usually pretty good with getting these to bloom quite frequently for you. So that's kind of the light conditions that you're looking at. Something else too that I've noticed with African violets is they actually don't mind to be a little bit more root bound. And in fact, sometimes I've found that they flower a little bit better whenever they're more heavily root bound. Now, with that being in mind, if the African violet has been in the pot for way too long, you definitely want to upgrade it to at least a size up. So like for us, say it's in a 4-inch pot, if it's heavily root bound and it's starting to show signs of maybe deficiency or things like that, then maybe move it up to a 6-inch pot. So don't move it up higher than one size or 2 inches when it comes to pot sizes. So just something to keep in mind there. But that is one thing I've noticed, that they tend to do okay being root bound. So when it comes to other care tips, information about African violets, so really what we think about is watering. And that's where they kind of get the reputation of being a tad finicky. And honestly, once you've learned to water them, once you've kind of figured that out, they actually are pretty easygoing houseplants. So the thing you have to watch is your water temperature. You want to make sure you have lukewarm water. You don't want the water to be cold. You don't want it to be too hot, because if that water splashes on the leaves, that could discolor them, where you get almost this weird striping or mottling appearance, and it could, kind of brown up those leaves, especially with really cold water. So be cautious with that. So when you're watering, make sure you're watering the soil good with lukewarm water. It's not splashing on the leaves. Protect the leaves. Or ideally maybe choose like a bottom watering method with African violets too. So then you're just avoiding water getting on the foliage altogether. So, but primarily a lot of those issues are going to be coming from if it's really cold or really hot water. So watering's basically the main thing there. When it comes to other aspects, humidity, these do well. They can tolerate lower humidity or higher humidity. Really, like mine do pretty well. Even in a more low humid environment, where especially in the winters, if I don't get to like 30 to 40 percent with humidity in the house, they tend to do okay with that. But one thing I will say that they may not do okay with, like, you want to avoid placing them either in a window that's really drafty, where they could get some of that cold coming in, or also putting them near like a vent, where especially in the winter months when there's a lot of heat flowing, they don't appreciate that intense heat coming from those vents. So avoid placing them near vents, avoid placing them in drafty windows. Otherwise, they're going to do really well in an east-facing windowsill for you. So that's the main thing there. Now, when it comes to aspects like fertilizing, you're going to fertilize them when they're actively growing. So you're going to be fertilizing them, especially spring into summer. You're going to slow down fertilization in the fall, and then they're really not going to need fertilizer in the winter. You want to watch over fertilizing, because if you're giving them a fertilizer, especially that's too high in, say, nitrogen, that may cause the plant to have very beautiful deep green leaves, lush leaves, but that may cause the plant to not flower as much, because sometimes if we give a plant too much nitrogen, it's going to really help the growth of the foliage, but kind of prohibit blooms from coming. So be mindful of that. And there are African violet fertilizers that you can get out there. One thing I should have also mentioned when it comes to watering with the soil, always stick your pinky down in the soil. Test, with the first 1 to 2 inches of soil, especially if you're kind of just watering normally. If that feels pretty dry to the touch, then you're going to want to water your African violet. If it's pretty moist still, then you don't need to water it, because you do want to avoid overwatering these plants. They don't mind it a little moist, but if they're just really drowning in water, that's when you could get a lot of root, stem rot, crown rot diseases. And so you just want to be mindful of that. Try not to overwater your plant. And so when it comes to, with that in mind, any other issues that you might see with your African violet is that when it comes to pest issues, really primarily what I see are thrips. And so thrips like to go in the blooms, they like to hide in the blooms, and so they can kind of feast on your plants a little bit. You can kind of tell if you have thrips if your plant is blooming and you're just kind of seeing all this pollen that's scattered everywhere, and you didn't touch it, like you didn't accidentally hit it or anything. Sometimes that's kind of a sign that there could be thrips there. But then also what you could do, if you're not sure, get just like a white piece of printer paper and like gently tap your plant over that white paper, and sometimes you can see the thrips come on to the paper, and they're kind of they're very tiny, long, thin, kind of orangey colored insects that you might see moving around on there. So be mindful of thrips. There are certain bacterial or fungal diseases. Sometimes you might get, kind of this mold growth, like especially on the flowers. Those are a little bit less common. As long as you're keeping your plant in a well-ventilated area, you're not having water splash everywhere among the flowers and the foliage, and you're buying healthy plants in general from the store, then you should be okay. Other than that, I don't see a lot of other disease issues or pest issues with African violets. Anyway, I think that'll about do it for African violets. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.